Hey everybody, welcome to yet another Forza Horizon 5 car upgrading tune video. I say yet another because there are dozens of upgrade guides already out there, and I know it's not cool to reference other YouTube channels unless you're hating on them, but that's just not how I work. And I will cover my own process, but I'm going to recommend two very good guides as well. After all, we are a community. The first is the guide that set the standard for everybody else, the guide or guides really by Hoki. His is more geared towards how things work in the real world, and secondly, the guide by SP4, which goes into the video game quirks of Forza Horizon. There are links to both Hoki's and SP4's guide in the description below, so if you haven't watched them already, I highly recommend doing so. But, like I said, this isn't a how-to video where the how-to is simply telling you to watch other people's guides.
I command you.
I'll go through the menus and options myself, comparing and contrasting along the way, and hopefully provide some additional or even unique insight. Now, before we get started in the upgrade menus and then move on into the second half of the video, the tuning menus, there are a few things that are important to touch on, so bear with me for a few minutes here. Car class, understeer and oversteer, and anatomy of a turn. For car class, I won't go into too much detail. If you're ready to craft your own cars, I assume you know how the car class system works. But if you are brand new or this is your first guide, here they are on screen. And it is worth mentioning that the further you upgrade away from a car's stock class, the less competitive it will be against cars that start off in that higher class. But like most things, there will be exceptions. The best way to explain understeer and oversteer is using these visuals. This is an example of extreme understeer, and this is an example of extreme oversteer. All-wheel drive and front-wheel drive cars are prone to understeer, and rear-wheel drive cars are prone to oversteer. Okay, the anatomy of a turn. There are three phases to a turn: corner entry or turn in, mid-turn, and corner exit. These are pretty straightforward, but it's good to keep in mind where the weight of the car is during these phases. Corner entry is when you're braking or slowing down to enter the turn and the weight of the car shifts to the front. Mid-turn is when you're not braking or accelerating and continue the turn and the weight shifts towards the outside of the car. And corner exit is when you're coming out of the turn and have the throttle engaged, thus shifting the weight to the rear of the car. And you can have understeer or oversteer in each phase of the turn for all drivetrains. Okay, one final comment before we get into the garage, and this is important to keep in mind. There is no one set rule to anything. There are always exceptions, as I mentioned once already. Cars vary, and quite a bit. What works for one car may not work for another. And on a related note, what works for me may not work for you. If you watch or read 10 guides, you'll find 10 differing approaches, varying slightly to varying dramatically, and that's because each person's guide is a reflection of their own driving style. But therein lies the beauty of car upgrade and tuning. There are general truths to how things work, and you take what others do within those truths and experiment yourself, and find out what works best for you. Alright, shall we get into the garage? Starting with conversion. Everyone on the planet starts here, and you should too, because you need to decide what drivetrain you want, all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive, and I suppose front-wheel drive. But in this game, you get the most out of all-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. Some things to consider. Rear-wheel drive cars are lighter, so is front-wheel drive by the way, thus all-wheel drive cars are heavier, and weight is something you usually want to shed when racing. However, with power being sent to all four wheels, all-wheel drive cars do accelerate better and are much easier to handle. But they do lack the end power of a rear-wheel drive car. Typically speaking, rear-wheel drive cars are faster and can chase down all-wheel drive cars in a race. This is not only due to being lighter, but swapping to all-wheel sometimes costs a lot of PI that could otherwise be spent on power. Occasionally, you'll find swapping to all-wheel actually refunds PI though. It comes down to what it is you're building for. Is it rally? Is it street? Is it rivals? Is it multiplayer? Is it single player? Whatever. Also, know what your driving skill is or your preference. Through tuning, you can make the launch and cornering much more manageable in a rear-wheel drive, but ultimately, throttle and brake management is key to rear-wheel drive driving. So if you slam down on the controls, or pedals if you got a sim setup, and don't use any finesse whatsoever, or God forbid, use a keyboard, where finessing the throttle and brake isn't even an option, rear-wheel drive is going to be much harder to handle, and probably not even a choice. That all said, I typically do convert to all-wheel drive. The stability in the mass chaos of multiplayer is hard to beat, and in rally and off-road, it's almost a must. But I have been driving more rear-wheel drive in FH5 than I ever have in FH4, especially in things like Street Scene and Rivals. Okay, let's move on to engines. There are a ton, and SP4's video has a good list of the most efficient engines in relation to PI cost, which is quite useful. But some other things to keep in mind is the racing version of an engine is much lighter. You can see this racing V12 is 300 pounds lighter than the regular V12. And also take note of torque. If your car keeps spinning out, no matter what other parts you have on or what settings you have in the tuning menus, swapping to an engine with less torque may solve your problem. But above all, like I said before and will say many more times, know what it is you're building for and experiment, experiment, experiment. Okay, aspiration. Depending on the engine, you may see aspiration options. I agree with SP4's advice, which is to use the centrifugal supercharger because it's the most PI efficient.
It's good advice.
And here's why. Though the power band for positive displacement is better, the PI cost for a centrifugal is less, and so is the upgrade for it in the engine upgrade menu, which allows for you to add other engine upgrades that you otherwise couldn't, ultimately resulting in a greater amount of power exceeding the benefits of the positive displacement supercharger, most of the time. If it's not an option, I have no problem using the positive displacement supercharger, and if that's not an option, I'll use the twin turbo. That's all assuming I have the PI to spare for any aspiration in the first place. It is worth noting too that twin turbos are the most powerful if you're going for an all-out power build, but don't forget about turbo lag, the split second of time that it takes for turbo power to kick in, whereas both superchargers deliver instant power. Lastly are body kits, which not all cars have. Aside from, in most cases, making the car look cool, it can add a good amount of handling. Adding a body kit will remove the front bumper option, and also removes the front and rear track width options. I personally don't like these. Body kits add a lot of weight, more than just adding a front splitter. And there are tricks you can play around with in regards to track width to maximize handling. Though, that won't be reflected in the on-screen specs. Take the specs with a grain of salt. And one last thing. Body kits usually cost more PI than just adding a front splitter and adjusting track width. Next in the menus is Aero and Appearance. Front bumper or splitter helps with handling, but more so with higher class cars simply because they're faster. It will also negatively impact top straight line speed, and this can be costly in regard to PI, and because of that, I used to build without adding the front splitter on all builds, adding it later if needed, but I got tired of adding it back on in most S1 and above cars. So now with S1 or higher, I add it up front.
Did you see what I did there?
With some rare exceptions. You can always go in and remove it if the car has too much oversteer. It's most likely not needed at all on D and C class, but again, exceptions are out there. In A and B class, it really depends, but start without it. Rear bumper or wing can also help with handling and also for higher class cars, but at a greater cost to drag and therefore top speed. Aside from the Forza version looking like your local high school kid's Mitzer Subi wing, I usually add this to most builds because it drops your PI by quite a bit, and you can tune out most, but not all, of the hit to top speed in the tuning menus. But if you straight up need more speed, just plain and simple, you need more speed, and handling is of no concern whatsoever, consider removing the rear wing, because even though more power was added through an extra engine part or two and the hit to top speed was adjusted out, a lot of the time those extra parts and that tuning adjustment won't be enough to overcome the reduction of top speed by having that rear wing on there. Just something to keep in mind. Depending on the car, there may be other options in this menu, and they mostly have to do with appearance. They may shave or add a point here and there, and therefore are good to save for the very end. Let's get into the next menu, and this is a large one. The first option in tires and rims is tire compound, and really, this is the most important menu, and the PI ramifications reflect that, but don't skimp here. Tires not only help with handling, but with braking and acceleration. And don't cheat your build. Using poor quality tires in relation to the build won't work. For dirt and off-road, what everyone says is sound. Off-road compound is plenty good for both off-road and rally, and pretty much for any car class. However, you can get away with a lower quality street-based compound on D, C, and some B-class rally and cross-country cars. For tarmac or street builds, use slick racing tires for S2 class. Semi-slick just won't cut it a majority of the time. For S1, Start with semi-slick, and if you need more grip, toss on the slicks here as well. There is something you can try in place of using slick tires that I'll mention in the front tire width menu, but more on that in a second. For A and some B class, Sport or semi-slick should do the job, but start with Sport unless you have the PI to spare. And for other B and C and D class, Street or Sport should get you by just fine. There are other specialty tire compounds such as Drift and Drag, and use accordingly, and some older cars have a vintage tire option. Just take a look at the PI cost versus grip benefit of the vintage tire, and make an educated decision to use them or not. In summary, I will always try and upgrade at least one tire compound from stock on all builds, but sometimes you can't, because a tire compound can vault a car into the next car class all on its own, and you're forced into using a lower quality tire than you'd like, but really try to use the best you can. It is one of the most important upgrades. Next up is front tire width, one of the more overrated upgrades in the game, often due to PI cost, but mostly due to handling impact. Increasing tire width, front or rear, increases the contact patch of the tire with the surface, and thus increasing grip. However, front tire width's return on investment just isn't all that great. I'll pop these on in the rare occasions I need a little bit more handling, and I've exhausted every single other option available. This also should have more impact with front wheel drive, but it's minimal at best. And though better in a front wheel drive situation, they're still usually not worth the PI. In regards to the slick tire compound trick I mentioned earlier, when needing to use slick tires, the combination of semi-slick plus the widest front tire width will occasionally work equally well, or in rare cases even better, than just using the slick tire by itself. It's not often, okay, just keep that in mind. But the benefit is the PI cost of using semi-slick plus wide front tire is less than using the slick tire, and those saved points can be spent elsewhere. Now, I mentioned this trick more to demonstrate what experimenting can uncover. Don't be afraid to mess around in the virtual garage and see what kinds of things you can come up with to give you that little extra edge. Alright, following front tire width is rear tire width, a decent benefit to handling and a home run in terms of PI. It rarely will increase your PI on high class cars, and sometimes even reduces it. When you do get into lower class cars, this upgrade may cost a tad more, and in a rear wheel drive, that's where it costs the most. But when compared to front tire width, it's almost always cheaper and provides a better driving benefit. So pretty much in all builds, I toss on the widest option. It provides stability and handling, and for no to little cost. It's a no-brainer. Rim style, I save for the very end. It's great for increasing or reducing your PI by a point or two. Also, if I need to add weight to drop my PI a bit, I prefer to do so with rims, since the weight added is distributed evenly across the car via the 4 tires. Now, to be honest here, I don't know if the game takes into account where the weight is, or if it just uses total weight in its physics calculations, but in the event it is that sophisticated, I'll add weight here first. Front rim size has some impact on handling, and can be viewed as the poor man's or poor woman's way to increase your contact patch, providing more grip, but to a lesser degree than tire width. I usually bump up a rim size for tarmac builds, maybe 2 for rally and a third or more for cross country. Each larger size will add more weight, and if you put on a heavier rim, that added weight is magnified, so keep that in mind. But the added weight can also sometimes be a good way to reduce your PI if needed. Rear rim size is quite similar, and quite frankly, what I do in the front, I do in the rear. Track width. For both front and rear, a wider track width reduces weight transfer, increasing grip, which, by now I'm sure you've gleaned, grip is good, for not only stability but handling too. For front wheel drive, you'll get the best results with the widest front and a narrower rear. And for rear wheel drive, you'll get the best results with a narrower front and the widest rear. And for all wheel drive, you can play around and get creative. Most people just go widest for both front and rear, but having the front wider than the rear can produce more oversteer, though the specs won't reflect it. A lot of the time, the right combination of wider front and narrower rear will be able to produce a similar handling benefit, if not better, than a body kit at a much lower PI cost. You will need to play around with the various combinations though. I will mention that for rallying off-road, I don't do that little trick. It's too oversteery for surfaces that are compromised. That was the biggest menu to cover, and now we move on to drivetrain. First up is clutch, which isn't always an option you'll see. This is one of the more seemingly random PI cost upgrades. You can be sure that it does reduce weight by a little and might improve your shift time. A lot of the times it's a 0-second improvement though. If there is a shift time improvement, you'll realize the max benefit if you drive an automatic. I've seen very small weight reduction, like 3 pounds, and 0 shift time improvement somehow cost several PI points. And I've seen decent relative weight reduction, like 15 pounds, and some shift time improvement not cost any or just a few PI points. I don't know how this is calculated, so it's something I upgrade on a case-by-case basis. Since I drive an automatic for my Forza videos, if it improves shift time and doesn't cost more than a few PI points, I'll add it, unless it prevents me from adding a different part that I really want on my build. Sometimes this is good to save for the very end. For transmission, stock is usually 6 or 7 gears, so just unlock Final Drive, which is sport transmission. Sometimes with 6 gears, you may need to bump up to 7, if you can't adjust Final Drive enough in the tuning menus. If you want to adjust each individual gear, you'll need to upgrade another notch to race transmission. There are only 2 reasons I see for using 8 or more gears, well, 3 actually. First is sometimes stock is 8+ gears, and though you can downgrade to fewer gears, if stock is more, I typically keep it and just unlock Final Drive. Second reason is if you need to drop a PI point or 2 and you already added weight through rims. More gears is more weight. And third reason is if you have a sim setup and your gear shift has more than 7 gears. You may as well use the 9-speed transmission if your sim setup has 9 gears. Driveline is yet another save for the very end upgrade. However, this one is always worth checking because it sometimes can cost 0 PI. It's nothing more than a weight reduction benefit. Last is diff. Always free, and it's as simple as pick the one for the discipline you're building for. Race, rally, drift, or off-road. Continuing our march backwards through the upgrades, we have platform and handling. First up is brakes, and they cost a lot of PI when upgrading to the point of unlocking the tuning setting. A point to consider first. Brakes are closely tied to weight reduction and tire compound. And if you use good weight reduction and tire compound, upgrading the brakes is far less important. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, ultimately, upgrading brakes will cost you in power by consuming PI points. On the plus side, upgrading not only reduces braking distance, but also shaves off a decent amount of weight. So the extra power gained from not upgrading and adding an engine part might be negated due to those 2 benefits. At the end of the day, driving style plays a large role here, and upgrading them is a personal preference. If you don't upgrade, know that you'll need to brake earlier and possibly have a slightly different driveline, regardless of weight reduction and tire compound. Personally, after a lot of testing, and this is assuming I have my ideal weight reduction and tire compound installed, I found the upgrade useful only for tarmac racing when using fast cars. I can brake later and attack a corner more aggressively. I didn't like having to brake earlier and enter a turn less directly. My lap times for both setups were pretty close though. I don't upgrade them on rally or cross country, and for A-Class and lower, I leave them stock unless it's a faster A-Class car. And it goes without saying that in any situation, if I need better braking, I go back into the garage and upgrade them. Springs are more straightforward. They greatly come into play with corner entry and corner exit. And of course bumps, jumps, and all the various road imperfections. Like diff, I'll upgrade them to the discipline I'm building for, if they cost only a few PI points, which is the usual case. Sometimes they do cost a lot though, and I'll run with stock springs. Front and rear anti-roll bars greatly impact all 3 phases of cornering, but especially mid-turn, and are key to oversteer and understeer tuning. They're usually free or cost very little, and are always worth the cost, regardless. Add the race anti-roll bars on all builds and all drivetrains. Chassis reinforcement and roll cage may seem pointless due to the often huge weight addition and sometimes oddly high PI cost. Most people ignore or skip this category altogether, but I sometimes find it useful when in a mid-turn, if the car feels a little like it's on skates or loose gravel, or it slips traction on more gradual and therefore higher speed corners instead of hugging the corner, I'll throw on some chassis reinforcement here, starting with the most basic. That's only after messing around with ARB settings, springs and ride height, and if I can't further upgrade the tire, due to the huge cost of tire upgrades. I found this category to be useful in that scenario, even for dirt, but it's harder to identify the problem in rally and cross-country racing. I've also found cars that need these upgrades are typically not the most competitive to begin with. But as usual, that's not true 100% of the time. Finally, weight reduction. Second only to tire compound in importance. This is a good time to point out, if you haven't already guessed, that I prefer handling rather than power when upgrading. A car that is slower on straightaways but faster around corners will win most of the time. Unless they are significantly slower on straightaways, then it won't matter how well the car corners. And therein lies the challenge of building a car. Creating one that flies around corners, but not at an overly great expense to straight line speed. And a lighter car goes a long way in fast cornering. And not only that, acceleration and braking are very much positively impacted too. Always try and use the max weight reduction. Like tire compound, it's very costly, but usually worth it. If I can't use the max weight reduction for whatever reason, I'll bump it down a notch, and if I can't even use that, at this point, the weight reduction is minor in relation to the PI cost. You may be better off using the PI on power instead. And I do want to reiterate, because I don't want to mislead or misrepresent, if I am underpowered, I'll drop the front splitter or the brake upgrade, or both, and maybe not go with max weight reduction, or any weight reduction, or forego the tire upgrade entirely. Most races in Forza are loaded with turns and curves, and that's why building towards cornering usually makes the most sense. But there are races with long straights or gradual turns, and your car that handles curves like a dress on Salma Hayek will lose. So once again, it always comes down to what you're building for and what your preference is. But always experiment. We're down to the last category, which is engine. And here's where you finish spending whatever PI points you have remaining. Quick tip, if you don't have any remaining, in most cases, not all, but most, you won't be powerful enough to compete. But first, before I ever go into this menu, this is when I go all the way back to aspiration and decide if I want to or can use turbos or superchargers. And if aspiration was upgraded, an upgrade for it will be available, and I'll take that, if I have the PI left for it, as it can be pretty costly. Note that turbo upgrades will also add some weight. Depending on the engine and the car, you may have a few other parts to select from, or as many as a dozen or so. All parts, except the flywheel, increase power to one degree or another. Some have additional benefits or disadvantages, or both, but are mostly minor. Of the most common parts to pick from, camshaft is the only one that extends your rev range. Valves, intake, and exhaust all reduce weight, with exhaust shaving off a decent amount. Fuel system, displacement, ignition, and camshaft don't impact weight. Intercooler and oil and cooling will add weight. I'll typically avoid those, especially if I added the turbo aspiration upgrade. And the flywheel is a very small weight reduction benefit you can use to round out your build. This entire menu is largely personal preference, and a little bit like a puzzle, adding or removing various parts to milk the most power possible in reaching the class's max PI allowance, or come to as close to it as possible. If you're a few points short or over, that's okay. All those save for the very end upgrades come into play here. Access those menus and upgrades to either trim some PI or add some PI, whichever is needed. For reference, driveline and flywheel will increase your PI. Rim size, clutch, and transmission will reduce PI. Rim style and options in Aero and Appearance, if any, can add or reduce PI. And that's pretty much it for upgrading, and it's finally time for the second part of the video, tuning. And what I'll be covering is how to set up a base tune. Very few, if any, cars don't need any additional tuning, and most cars will require significantly more fine tuning. Again, each car is different. And once again, driving style is important here too. What works for me may not work for you. And unlike upgrades, where most guides are somewhat similar, tuning is where you can see some pretty dramatic differences from one guide to the next, especially in things like suspension and diff. One final thing, I don't use rear-wheel drive for rally or cross-country, so any mention of rear-wheel drive is for tarmac, or in other words, street and road driving. Okay, let's get going. Starting with tire pressure, this one is pretty basic here. Lower pressure increases grip, but too low and you'll actually start losing grip. And higher pressure will increase responsiveness, but too high will also lose grip. I'm in a bit of a minority here, but I like lower pressure for the front and higher for the rear. And I like a wider gap between front and rear as well, setting front to 25 and rear to 29 for tarmac, and 22 and 25 for rally, and 18 and 20 for off-road. And for rear-wheel drive, I flip it, 29 for front and 25 for rear. For gearing, first take a look at the bottom left corner. Acceleration and speed is what you're really adjusting here, and on the bottom right is the graph you'll use to do so. If only final drive is unlocked, slide it so the last gear is somewhere within the last box and a half of the graph. Pay attention to the top speed and acceleration as you do so. I personally set it to a compromise between top speed and best acceleration. Usually they are one and the same, but sometimes they're not. If you have more than 7 gears, things can get a little weird. The best setting may have the later gears off the graph completely. If you have full gear ratio tuning unlocked, slide all the gears onto the graph, then adjust them so the later gears follow the natural progression of the graph, then use final drive to get that last gear into the corner, again paying attention to top speed and acceleration. For rear wheel drive, a trick that you can do to make launch a little more smooth is lengthen first gear or slide it towards speed. Obviously you need full gear ratio tuning unlocked to do this, but it is something you can play around with for rear wheel drive. For a little different approach, check out SP4's video. It's a good way to adjust this setting as well. Next up is alignment, and the first setting is camber, which is the vertical angle the tires sit. You'll see this very noticeably on drift cars. Some negative front and rear camber is good for cornering. I first set front to -0.6 and rear to -0.9 for tarmac, and -0.6 for both front and rear for rally and off-road. Using the telemetry window can hone in on a better setting. Looking at the outside tire on a turn, for front I shoot for around -0.5, and for rear around -0.3. The numbers bounce around like crazy, so there's some estimating here. Watch Hoki's video on how to access telemetry. Toe is the horizontal angle the tires sit, with toe out pointing outwards, away from the car, and toe in pointing inwards, towards the nose of the car. Toe negatively impacts speed, and I hardly ever touch this on tarmac tunes. And on dirt and off-road, I'll sometimes set front toe out to 0.2 and rear toe in to -0.1. If a street or road car handles like a bathtub, after doing everything I possibly can do in both upgrades and other tune settings, I'll finally resort to adjusting toe. Last is caster. Just set this to 7. It's helpful for both straight line stability and cornering. A best of both worlds kinds of thing. In the real world, a high caster makes for heavy steering, where the driver needs to have strength and endurance, but using a controller, that doesn't apply. On a side note, I don't know if a sim rig with force feedback actually takes caster into account. If so, maybe lower it here. You don't want to tire yourself out playing a video game after all. Anti-roll bars really impact mid-turn because the weight of the car is on the outside when cornering, but they also play a large role in the entire cornering process. They're probably the most important setting when tuning, at least in this video game. ARBs are one of the settings where the arcade nature of Forza Horizon comes into play. You want some extremes here as it helps a lot. Softer front and stiffer rear adds oversteer, with the opposite adding understeer. For tarmac, I start with front at 5 and rear at 60, which gives me a little wiggle room when fine-tuning, but very often I do end up with 1 and 65. For dirt and off-road, since you're sliding around more due to the nature of the road, start front at 10 and rear at 35. For rear-wheel drive, again, you want to adjust towards understeer due to the inherent oversteer nature of rear-wheel drive, so start front at 20 and rear at 45, and adjust from there. On to springs. This setting is how far the suspension moves or travels, and if you remember, with corner entry, the weight of the car is in the front, so front springs have a big impact on corner entry, and with corner exit, the weight shifts to the rear, so rear springs will have a big impact on corner exit. In short, softer front springs and stiffer rear springs will promote oversteer, the opposite promoting understeer. This too is pretty video gamey, and you'll usually want a very soft front versus a somewhat stiffer rear setting. But if the front is too soft, it can get sluggish, and similar to tires, it will start to have the opposite effect, so stiffen it. And a too stiff rear setting will cause the rear to slide out, so soften it. And for rear wheel drive, start with having the front and rear settings closer together, having front slightly softer. Then go from there. Sometimes rear wheel drive, the front will be stiffer than the rear. It really depends. Now if you want, you can use a formula to calculate these settings, but it can be a lot and get overwhelming, and it's not necessary. I learned it from Hoki's FH4 video, and he himself doesn't use it anymore. Personally though, I'm a bit of a nerd at heart, and I still do use it. However, the vast majority of people won't bother, so the formula and calculations are in a separate video, linked up top and in the description below. Okay, for ride height. A lower car creates a lower center of gravity, which increases grip and therefore handling. At least it should. But SP4's video points out the video game quirkiness of this setting as well. Though I don't like to maximize ride height like SP4 does, I also don't minimize it. I found a sweet spot of sorts, at least one that works well to start with. 5 inches for the front for pavement, 8 for rally, and 11 for off-road. And I do set the rear a ½ inch higher than the front if I can. Sometimes I can't set the right height to what I want because the car doesn't go low enough or high enough at its minimum or maximum setting. So in those scenarios, I just get it as close as I can, which means on occasion, the ride height is set to the minimum or maximum. Ride height is a weird one that doesn't behave as it should in the real world, and though I start with those settings, I do find myself raising or lowering the ride height and playing with the difference between the two heights when I fine tune, but I don't spend a ton of time here. This setting isn't a game changer. Now we move on to dampers or shock absorbers. With springs being how far a suspension travels, dampers control how fast they travel. Softer is faster, and therefore stiffer is slower, but I'll refer to them as soft and stiff since that's what Forza uses. Bump is when a spring compresses, and rebound is when a spring decompresses, and bump is always set softer than rebound. Now, a spring will obviously compress and decompress when going over bumps or jumps, but also when cornering, and since bumps or jumps and cornering are two very different things, you set this very differently for rally and off-road versus tarmac. For rebound, since paved streets in Forza aren't all that bumpy, the main concern is cornering, and you can use a stiff setting to maintain contact with the road. That won't work for dirt and off-road, so rebound for those disciplines needs to be quite a bit softer. For bump, you want the weight transfer to occur quickly for tarmac, and again, since most of the paved streets in Forza aren't full of potholes and imperfections, you can have a wide gap between rebound and bump, and that will give you the best cornering results. Again, not so much for dirt and off-road. The gap between rebound and bump needs to be smaller, but since rebound is much softer for dirt and off-road to begin with, bump settings will be softer for dirt and off-road than for tarmac. A typical tarmac setting may look like this, and a typical rally setting may look like this. And for off-road, those rally settings can be just a bit softer for all the settings. Lastly, if your car is too skittish over bumps or slides out, soften the end having the problem. And if your car is too sluggish or bouncy, stiffen the end having the problem. And just like springs, there is a formula for this too. It's essentially the same with some tweaks, so check that out if interested. Front aero helps a great deal with turn-in and control, which is really noticeable on higher class cars. I always set this to max downforce or cornering. If I wasn't going to do that, I'd just leave off the upgrade in the garage. For rear downforce, I'll divide the front setting by 1.2. If you don't want to do that quick calculation, for some A and higher class cars, this is usually a short ways up the slider. And for other A and lower class cars, this is almost always all the way at the minimum. When adjusting aero, I usually leave front alone, and I'll slide rear towards cornering if I need more stability or towards speed if I need more handling. For rear wheel drive, I'll also set the front to max downforce, and no math for the rear wing. I start at about 3/4 of the way up the bar, and if needed, keep on going towards max. Rear wheel drive cars are simply very oversteery, and you need to make several adjustments for that. Brakes are also pretty simple. For balance, a rear brake bias will provide oversteer, and a front brake bias will provide stability when braking. When setting this, the adjustable number is what the rear setting is, so don't really pay attention to the direction you're sliding the slider, just to the number itself. I set this to 47 for a slight front bias. For brake pressure, too high and you run the risk of your brakes locking up, which is something you want to avoid. I start with 110, but I'll call out that I use the brake trigger more like a brake pedal, and I don't always fully press the trigger. For rear wheel drive, I start with 40% for a significant front bias to help with stabilizing the back end, but I keep the pressure at 100%. Finally, differential, a somewhat confusing setting. Diff controls how much power is sent to the wheel with the least grip, so it's a setting for when the grip of your left and right tires will be different, which occurs mostly in cornering, since, in-game, there's not many scenarios when your left and right tires will be on totally different surfaces, like a patch of ice in the real world. With a lock diff, where the setting is at 100%, 50% of the power goes to each wheel. With an open diff, where the setting is at 0%, the less grip a tire has with the surface, the more power it will receive, up to 100%, if the tire has zero grip. Again, more of a real-world problem because of things like ice. Now, when cornering, the weight of the car is on the outside. Therefore, the outside tires have the most grip, and the inside tires have the least. Also, when cornering, the outside tire travels further in the same amount of time, as time doesn't function differently for each tire. Therefore, the outside tire moves faster. Keeping those two things in mind, inside tires having less grip and outside tires traveling faster, It follows we don't want a locked diff, where the same amount of power, 50%, is sent to each wheel, because as we just covered, the outside tire needs more power to travel faster. You also don't want an open diff. If it is completely open, the inside wheel receives the max power possible, again, because it has the least grip. It's not 100% of the power because the tire does have some grip, since it's not on ice or anything. It simply has less weight on it than the outside. So in short, though that wasn't a very short explanation, you want to send a solid amount of power to the outside wheel, but not too much, where you cross the threshold of the two tires being too similar in power received. So where do we set this thing then? At least for Forza Horizon games, and I can't speak for other sim racing games or the real world for that matter, but I've personally had the best results starting with 70% for front accel and 80% for rear accel for street and road racing. And you can always have rear higher than front. For dirt and off-road, since the surface is looser and not as grippy, the right and left tire are closer together in regards to how well they grip the surface, and therefore you don't need to send as much power to the outside. So I start with 60 for the front accel and 70 for rear accel. When fine-tuning, for all race types, going higher will give you more oversteer, up to a point, but for some cars, that point is very high. I've gone as high as 95% in the front and 100% in the rear. Though that makes no sense, remember, it's a video game. And if a car has too much oversteer, just lower the numbers. Alright, that was a lot to take in. The rest will be much quicker though. Front and rear decel has far less impact, and I set front decel to 5 and rear to 10 for tarmac, and front decel to 10 and rear to 15 for dirt and off-road. Going higher with decel will provide more stability and understeer when slowing down, for all race types, basically the opposite of acceleration. For rear-wheel drive, you only see rear acceleration and deceleration, and since rear-wheel drive is oversteer to begin with, we don't need a ton of power going to the outside rear tire, so start with 60 and 15. Last is balance, which is only an all-wheel drive setting. You want to send a lot of the power to the rear, but not too much to completely negate the front power. So I start that at 70 for road and 60 for dirt and off-road. That does it for tuning and the rest of the video. I didn't speak much about front-wheel drive, especially in tuning. I just don't prefer that drivetrain. But for the most part, front-wheel drive cars are largely tuned like all-wheel drive cars. Alright, I'm going to conclude with some sage final thoughts for those that want to stick around for another 90 seconds. Every car will benefit from a few extra minutes spent fine-tuning. In your favorite cars, those you can easily spend more time tuning than driving. Not just from tweaking sliders and tuning menus, but you may need to swap an upgrade or two, or in some cases, start over from scratch with an entirely different approach. Because of, you guessed it, exceptions. The game launched with over 500 cars, and no two are the same. So experiment, and use rivals as a test environment. Change one upgrade or one setting at a time. That's the only way to know specifically what made your car better or worse. And continue to learn. There are so many other guides out there, and like life, everyone has something to offer. Take what you want and leave the rest. Then learn some more. And on the flip side, no one out there knows everything. I don't, and I'm sure a lot of you are thinking,
You know nothing.
and even if there were some sort of all-knowing wizard out there, they couldn't tell you how to build and tune your car that is for you to drive. Because no one, but you, drives exactly like you. And so much of upgrading and tuning is a personal preference. So at the end of the day, there's no substitute for your own experience. Alright everybody, that's truly it, and I genuinely do appreciate you spending your valuable and limited time watching this video that ended up being far longer than I originally planned. And it wouldn't be an average dad video without... Oh, come on. The subscribe and like outro.
Don't make me destroy you. It is your destiny. I am your father.